Today we're beginning a new series on the book of 1 Peter. We're going to spend some time over the next couple of months working through this book section by section. And my hope for this journey is this: this book might cast a vision for us for how our life, our faith, can weave into everyday life. This book, I think, has a lot to speak about how we live our faith as Christians out in the world. It is interested with this question: what does faith mean come Monday morning as we go into our communities, our workplaces, our homes, our neighborhoods? In the opening section of 1 Peter, Peter names, I think, a challenge that a lot of us can probably relate to as he reaches out to these Christians scattered throughout these various communities. He names them as exiles. And it's an interesting word because the reality is most of the recipients of these letters, of this letter, are not actually foreigners. It's not primarily written to a Jewish audience, but to a Gentile audience. And so he's speaking to Greeks who live in Greece and Romans who live in Rome, and yet he calls them foreigners or exiles, people that are not of that particular region. And I think what he is doing here is naming a reality that a lot of us experience. He is naming the fact that they feel out of place in their own land. They feel out of step with the broader movement of the culture they are embedded in. Throughout this letter, we're going to see how the gospel clashes with the ancient world. It's a very brutal world. It's a world of oppression for those who are on the margins. It's a world that is oppressive to women. It's a world of immorality, a world of idolatry, and a world of violence. And as Peter writes out to reaches out to this group that is scattered, he sees them as experiencing this exile, the sense of being a foreigner, being out of place in their own land. And I just wonder if that perhaps names where some of us come today. Do you feel out of place in your own land at times? We too look out on a world that is marked by many of these similar dynamics. A world of violence, a world of injustice. There's a world of immorality that sometimes clashes with the vision we feel called to live. And in light of that, it can feel like we are foreigners in our own land, going against the reality. Some of those of you who are in public school, maybe our students maybe feel that. In our workplaces, sometimes we just feel out of step with our world. I was listening to a podcast by a great social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, this week. And he was just commenting about how our culture right now seems to be becoming increasingly angry and divisive, particularly in our social media spheres. And it was interesting, he was just talking about how those platforms are designed to really amplify those extremes. And in some of his research, he noticed that actually when you ask real Americans about where they stand on a variety of issues, only about 13% of our society really agrees with the far extremes, so the far left and the far right. And he says most of us live as the exhausted majority. I wonder if that maybe just names how some of us come today, sort of the exhaustion with a world that just seems to be kind of getting away from us, a world of so much division, so much anger. And we stand in that world as Christians and just feel a little bit helpless at times. How do we engage this space? What does it mean to live faithfully in light of a world full of all these problems? Now, in response to this challenge, there are a number of different ways we can react to the city, react to the world. And I think there are some unhelpful responses. They're understandable, but unhelpful. On one hand, on one extreme, there is a danger that we just simply assimilate to culture. And so this happens when we get out of step with our connection to the gospel and to the community, and we just begin to be formed and shaped by the culture outside these walls. And maybe that names a struggle for some of us today. We've had this major cultural disruption these last 2 years that has caused, I think, a lot of us to lose sight of our rhythms of community and connection. And I think there's a danger that we have that tendency to just drift and get caught up with culture. This was a problem for the Israelites many times in their exile experience. During the time of Samson, it became very extreme. They were assimilating to the Philistine way of life, losing their distinctiveness. Now, this can happen just very gradually. I think I've mentioned before C.S. Lewis's quote that the road to hell is a gradual one. It is a gradual slope without any signposts. I think we need to be just aware of that danger of slowly, over time, assimilating and becoming part of culture. Another response that I notice in our culture is that in our frustration and our exhaustion with a world full of just injustice and violence, is that we can become very angry towards culture. And so we could take on a posture of denouncing culture and speaking out against it. Timothy Keller, in his book, The Gospel of Life, describes this posture. This is when Christians respond to the prevailing culture with superiority and hostility. Some take a more passive approach and withdraw from any real interaction, just denouncing and bewailing the moral decay, while others aim to acquire culture power. And so this sets us in a posture of opposition and battle. Now, to be sure, there are certain things that we ought to speak out against in culture. But there's a danger of having this posture where we don't love the world or seek the redemption of the world, but we denounce and are opposed to the world. This also was a challenge for the Israelites. This week I was reading Psalm 137 in my own devotional life, and the Israelites are in Babylon as exiles, and they say, how can we even worship in a foreign land? And then they get really angry. It's this very violent language. Let's just dash our enemies against the rock. I was praying that on Monday, and I was like, I don't really know how to, am I supposed to be praying this? How do we enter into that? And on the one hand, I think there's space in prayer to just like lament and speak honestly about where we are at. But as we're going to discover in our journey this morning, that is not actually God's call to us in our response to culture, to just be angry and give up hope of being able to even follow God. And so there's this danger of having a posture of just denouncing the world. Lastly, and this isn't, again, an exhaustive list, but just some different postures we can have, is in our exhaustion with the world, another danger is to just withdraw from it and ignore it. Because it's so complex and overwhelming, one danger is the opposite of assimilation. It's a withdrawal, where we'll just huddle together as Christians in the safety of our building and see religion as just this private thing that's just between me and Jesus, kind of ignore all the things going on out in the world. Friends, in 1 Peter, I believe we see a different way to respond to culture, a different posture that we can take, a different way we can live as exiles in a world that seems so contrary to the things that we long for. In this short opening section, these first two verses, Peter begins to cast a vision for a way for us to engage this culture in redemptive and loving ways. What I'd like to do is organize our thoughts as we go through these first two verses around three different words that I think help us capture this bigger vision for cultural engagement. And today we're just going to look at the big picture, but throughout this series we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of how this actually plays out in our various spheres of influence. But I want to first explore how this opening section gives us a new posture towards the world. Again, not one of assimilation, renouncing, or withdrawing, but one that is much different. And there's a couple words in this text that give us a new posture towards culture. And the first is this interesting Greek word, paradidymus, which translates resident aliens. Resident aliens. It's a really interesting word because on the one hand, it describes us as exiles or foreigners or aliens in this world. So there's a sense of separateness. We are called to a different way of life. We aren't really at home in this world. And yet, we are to live as resident aliens. Aliens, exiles that take up residence, that engage, that participate fully in the place we have been planted. This is echoing what we see in the Old Testament journey of the Israelite people. In Jeremiah 29, the Israelites have just been told they are going to be in exile for 70 years. And many of them are praying Psalm 137, how can we even worship? Let's just dash our enemies against the rocks. And instead, God says this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens. And it goes on to say, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. We see this vision, this posture of being resident aliens. We are exiles. We feel out of place. We're going against the grain of culture. But Peter is calling us to build houses, move into the neighborhood, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which you have been planted. This word paradidomus is holding this tension, resident aliens. The second word that I think describes our posture and culture is this word scattered. To God's elect, these resident aliens scattered throughout all these provinces. There's this image for us in 1 Peter of being a church that is spread out. And there's actually some intentionality in that. Back in Acts chapter 1, when the church was being formed, God said, I have chosen you to be my witnesses, not just in Jerusalem, but in Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. We are called to be a scattered people. That there's intention in that. Throughout this letter, we're going to see again another tension, similar to resident aliens, and it's this tension of gathering and scattering. That a healthy missional church will gather and be formed, but will embrace their experience of being scattered, dispersed throughout the community. God has a purpose for us as people who are embedded throughout the community. Friends, I have this picture of our church, of all the places that we are currently scattered. You think about the cumulative ways that we are embedded in Whatcom County. We have people in healthcare. We have teachers in schools. We have students in schools. We have people that are engaging in volunteer places. We're in our communities, in our neighborhoods. We are scattered out into third places, like coffee shops and soccer teams. Can we embrace that as part of our calling as a church? Craig Okeson, in his book, A Public Missiology, has this image of weaving, and it's an image I've drawn for this series, this idea of being interwoven. And he says to weave a deep tapestry, there needs to be movement, this movement of gathering and scattering. I just picture the ways that, if we are intentional, we can weave this beautiful tapestry of the kingdom of God all throughout the county. I think we need to reframe our idea of mission. Mission isn't just doing programs in these walls. It can include that. That's part of it. But can we actually reframe our daily life as a way of living as resident aliens scattered in all these different areas? I want to discover together what it looks like for us to live out our faith in the places we're already planted for 40 hours a week. You might begin to reflect on that. What does it look like for you to live out your faith in these various spheres? We can explore that in this series. So that is our posture. A resident alien, a church scattered, embedded in the community. The second word I want to hold up for us is this word purpose. So this is our posture, but now I want to begin to explore, and it's hinted at in our text, that we are now given a new purpose in these various places that we are called to build houses and move into the neighborhood. I want to speak a word of encouragement to us, particularly those of us who feel in an in-between space or an uncomfortable space, where you feel that exile experience where I wish I was somewhere else. Just get me back to Jerusalem. I don't know what your Jerusalem is, right? And in those times, I think we live a lot of our life in those uncomfortable in-between places. But what the writer of 1 Peter does is he infuses that place, that exile experience, with purpose. That God actually has placed you here. There is work that can be done in your life and in your sphere of influence in the in-between time, in the uncomfortable places. We aren't outside of God's will when we feel like exiles. In our text, we read in verse 2 that God has chosen, we've been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father through the sanctifying work of the Spirit. We hear some intention in this. As he's speaking to these people who are exiled, scattered, disconnected, he says, this is part of what God foreknew and chose you for. In the Message version, Eugene Peterson paraphrased it this way. He says, not one of you is missing, not one forgotten. God the Father has his eye on each of you. Can that be encouraging to those of us in places of discomfort, of suffering, places of exile, that God sees you and there can be purpose in these places of challenge. Dennis Edwards is a biblical scholar, and he helps us understand this word foreknowledge. And he says this: foreknowledge is not simply knowledge or even knowledge before an event. Rather, it means that whatever happens does so in accord with God's purpose. That's part of what's being communicated in this passage. God knew that this would be part of the early church experience. God knew where you would be planted. And there was intention in that. Can we see some of the purpose in where we are planted? I mentioned that there's echoes here from Jeremiah 29. The Israelites are in Babylon. The writer of Peter describes in a couple places in this letter that their experience is like living in a metaphorical Babylon. And what's interesting is that it's in this context that we encounter one of the most quoted biblical verses in Christianity. Who knows Jeremiah 29:11? Right? If you quote it, "For I know the plans I have for you." I'm going to just pull it up for you. Declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. We quote this verse, and it's such a hopeful verse. I use this as my graduating quote. Like, there's hope that God has plans for my future. But I rarely have noticed that this verse was written to people who have just been told that they will be in exile for 70 years. We take that verse out of the context, right? And I think they're probably saying, well, what do you mean plans to prosper and not to harm me? We're in Babylon. How can I worship here? I just want to smash my enemies. Get me out of here. What Jeremiah 29:11 is intending to say is that even in the places of exile, the places of pain, God is working out his purposes, leading us to a place of flourishing, that there is intention and purpose in where you are right now. Can that maybe speak some hope to some of us today, if we're in these in-between places? Sometimes the path to that hope and that future, to be prosperous, is through the exile, not around it, not avoiding it, through the challenge. I think there's a missional opportunity for us, a purpose in our current place where we have been planted here in Whatcom County. Traditionally, we have thought of missions as going away to foreign lands where the gospel has not been brought. And that's part of missions, and that's still part of mission today. Again, it's a both-and thing. But we now are currently scattered, embedded in a community that also needs the gospel. And these cultural shifts we've encountered in the last few decades, we now live in this post-Christian world, as some sociologists call it. This is Leslie Newbegin, and a great missiologist, who says, the most urgent contemporary mission field is to be found in our own traditional heartlands. And the most aggressive paganism with which we have to engage is the ideology that now controls the developed world. Can we have eyes to see the way that God wants to weave us into a world that needs to hear good news? in our own backyard. In our own backyard. So there is a purpose for us. This last word I want to leave us with, and every once in a while I got to just find a good alliteration, mainly just to annoy Stephen. It's the classic. But I want to hold up this word provision. And the word that I see as we look at this second part of the verse is that as we are sent out into really hard places where we are exhausted and sad and overwhelmed, that we go sent by the power of the triune God. God equips us for this call. And so there is this other tension here between being sent, but then also being nurtured and formed. Friends, it takes a transformed life to transform the world. And I'm not sending you out to go burn out and just try really hard to change this world through self-effort. I've tried that. It's been pretty exhausting. Can we notice the provision of God for these people in exile? In 1 Peter 1:2. You are a people who have been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, through the sanctifying work of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and sprinkling by his blood. Grace and peace be yours in abundance. Can you notice the whole Trinity is at work here? Father, Son, and Spirit. And that it is our participation in the work of God that enables us to be part of this beautiful kingdom work in a broken world. A God who has called us in love. A Spirit who empowers us and forms us, sets us apart. And the Son of God who disciples us into obedience, but also has offered us his grace, the sprinkling of his blood, which offers us forgiveness, which empowers us, infuses us with new life, with grace. And so as we think about stepping into the missional life, can I invite us to be ministered again by the triune God who is in our midst? You know, one of the purposes of why we gather on Sunday is to be filled up, hopefully. That's the vision, that we gather to be equipped, to hear the word, to be supported in community, to come to the table so that we are filled anew for Monday morning. And I don't know what awaits you tomorrow morning. Some of the challenges in your workplace, the relationships that are strained, the various intersections you have with a world of pain, kids you're worried about. Can we be filled again and ministered to again this morning in preparation for that by Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, God who is here with us today?